When your wife's phone lights up at 2 in the morning, you don't expect to see another man's name. You tell yourself there's got to be a reason, something innocent. But when I saw Dean Russell flash across Clara's screen that night, my stomach twisted. I reached for her phone and she snatched it up before I could even read the message. She laughed, not a nervous laugh, not a guilty one, just cruel amusement, like I'd asked a stupid question. "Why is your ex texting you at 2 a.m.? I asked. She turned to me, smiling like she pitied me. "You're paranoid. Maybe that's why I'm not attracted to you anymore." I stood there in the half-dark, watching the glow from her screen light her face while she went back to typing. I didn't say another word. I just nodded, climbed back into bed, and stared at the ceiling until the room turned gray with morning. When Clara woke up, I wasn't there. Neither were my clothes, my photos, or any trace that I had ever lived in that house. The wedding album was gone. My side of the closet hung empty. Even the mug I used every morning was missing from the counter. But something else was waiting for her. Something small, silent, and powerful enough to make her call every single person we knew before the day was over. That's when the story really began. I've always believed a quiet life was a good life. My name is Elliot Gaines, and for the last 15 years, I've worked as a postal route supervisor in a small Indiana town called Maple Hollow. It's the kind of place where everyone waves at each other, where the air smells like wood smoke and wet leaves in the fall, and where people stay married until they're buried side by side. That's what I thought my life would be. Simple, steady, safe. My wife, Clara, was the light in that small world. When I first met her, she was a waitress at a diner called May's Corner off Route 27. I stopped in for coffee one stormy afternoon, soaked through and half frozen from a long delivery shift. She spilled that same coffee all over my uniform, apologized for 10 minutes straight, and then sat down across from me on her break to make it right by buying me pie. She had this laugh that could pull you in, like the sound of a warm summer evening. I asked her out the next week, and within 2 years, we were married. Clara used to love the small-town rhythm. She liked planting flowers by the mailbox, gossiping with neighbors, and grilling in the backyard on Saturdays. But over time, she wanted more. More excitement, more people, more life outside Maple Hollow. She got her real estate license 5 years ago and started working in the city 40 minutes away. That was the beginning of the distance. At first, I thought it was just work. Late nights, new clients, her phone always ringing, but slowly, it became something different. She stopped waiting for me to get home before dinner. She started sleeping with her phone under the pillow. When she laughed, it wasn't with me anymore. It was at messages I couldn't see. My sister Margot noticed it before I did. She's a nurse, a little older than me, and not afraid to say what she thinks. One night, when I stopped by her house for dinner, she looked at me and said, "Elliot, you're doing that thing Dad used to do, pretending everything's fine when it's falling apart." I told her she was imagining things, that Clara was just tired, that people change. She shook her head. "Maybe, but don't wait until she changes her name too." My father, Walter Gaines, was the kind of man who didn't waste words. When my mother passed away 6 years ago, he told me one thing I never forgot. "A man's peace is in his home. Protect it, son. Once it's gone, you don't get it back." I used to think I understood that, but back then, my peace had a name. It was Clara. In the months before that night, I started to feel a strange tension every time I walked through our front door. The air was heavy. The lights felt too bright. Clara would smile at me, but her eyes never followed the smile. I'd ask how her day went, and she'd answer with one-word replies. "Fine, busy, tired." There were days when I caught her staring at her reflection longer than usual before she left for work. She'd change her outfit twice, sometimes 3 times, asking, "Do I look okay?" I'd tell her she looked beautiful, and she'd shrug like the compliment came from a stranger. I tried to fix things the way I knew how, acts of service. I replaced the faucet she'd been complaining about, painted the porch, cooked dinner when she worked late. But nothing seemed to touch her anymore. She was there in body but gone in spirit. I remember one evening in particular. I was watching a game on TV, and she was sitting at the kitchen table scrolling through her phone. She kept smiling, biting her lip like something she was reading made her blush. I asked, "Who's making you laugh like that?" She looked up, her tone casual but sharp. "A client. Don't start." I didn't press it. I told myself it was better to trust her than to live in suspicion, but deep down, I already knew something wasn't right. That night, as I lay in bed, I heard her in the bathroom whispering. Her voice was low and soft, the kind of tone you use when you don't want someone to hear. I listened without meaning to, catching fragments. Words like, missed you and can't tonight. I turned over and shut my eyes, pretending to sleep. My heart pounded in my chest so hard it hurt. In the morning, she was cheerful. She made pancakes and called me babe, like nothing had happened. I wanted to believe that smile. I wanted to believe she still loved me. I told myself I was just tired, that I was imagining things. But when she left that morning, she didn't kiss me goodbye. She used to kiss me every single day, even when we were mad at each other. That small absence said more than any argument could. At work, I found it hard to focus. I caught myself replaying that whisper in my mind, trying to match the tone with memories of the man she used to date, Dean Russell. He was the kind of man who filled every room he walked into. Loud, charming. The opposite of me. I'd met him once at a neighborhood barbecue. He'd shaken my hand, smiled too wide, and said, "You're lucky, Elliot. Clara's a catch." I'd felt something uneasy in that handshake, something I ignored because trusting Clara felt safer than doubting her. That evening, I came home to a cold dinner on the stove and an empty chair at the table. I found a note that said she was showing houses late. When I texted to ask if she wanted me to wait up, she didn't answer. I sat in silence for hours, the clock ticking like a heartbeat. When she finally walked in close to midnight, her hair was still perfect, her makeup fresh. She looked surprised to see me awake. "You're still up?" she asked, her tone light but defensive. I said, "I just wanted to make sure you got home safe." She smiled, but it didn't reach her eyes. "I'm fine, Elliot. You don't have to wait up anymore." Then she went straight to the shower. That was the moment I realized I had become a guest in my own home. The house that used to feel warm now felt like a stage where we both played roles we no longer believed in. I wanted to fight for her, to fix whatever had broken between us, but I didn't know where to begin. I was still holding on to the woman who had spilled coffee on me in that diner years ago, the one who laughed with her whole heart. The woman I loved was gone, replaced by someone who smiled at her phone more than she smiled at me. I went to bed that night staring at the ceiling, hearing the faint buzz of her phone again. I didn't know it then, but the question I asked a few days later at 2 a.m. would end our marriage, and the silence that followed would change everything I thought I knew about love, loyalty, and myself. 3 nights after that late return, I woke up to the sound of a soft buzz. The room was dark, the kind of deep quiet that only exists after midnight. The clock on the nightstand read 2:06 a.m. I rolled over and saw a faint glow coming from Clara's side of the bed. Her phone lit up, and for a moment, I caught the name before the screen dimmed again. Dean Russell. My pulse kicked hard. I froze, hoping I'd imagined it, but the name burned into my mind. I stared at the phone, at the silence it carried, at the woman lying next to me who had sworn she was mine. I reached out and touched her shoulder gently. "Clara," I said. She stirred, half awake, eyes heavy with sleep. "What is it?" she mumbled. "Why is Dean texting you at 2 a.m? Her face changed instantly. The soft confusion disappeared, replaced by that sharp alertness I had seen in her before when she was caught off guard. She blinked, then laughed. It wasn't a laugh of surprise or embarrassment. It was a laugh that stung, the kind that made you feel small. "You're paranoid," she said, pulling the blanket closer. "Maybe that's why I'm not attracted to you anymore." Her words cut through me with the precision of a knife. I waited for her to take it back, to say she didn't mean it, but she didn't. She rolled away, her phone still glowing faintly on the nightstand, and added, "Go back to sleep, Elliot. You're acting ridiculous." Something inside me went cold. I didn't yell. I didn't argue. I didn't touch her. I just sat there, listening to her breathing, wondering how long I'd been the only one trying. The room felt smaller, the air heavier, like the walls themselves were tired of the lies. I stared at the ceiling until dawn started to push through the curtains. When the alarm went off, she got up like nothing had happened. She moved around the room, humming softly, brushing her hair, checking her phone again and again. I watched her from the bed. She didn't look at me once. "Do you want coffee?" I asked, trying to sound calm. "No thanks. I'm meeting a client early," she said, slipping on her heels and grabbing her purse. Then she paused at the door. "Elliot, you really need to stop letting your imagination run wild. It's not healthy." She left before I could answer. The sound of the front door closing hit me like a final sentence. That morning, I drove to work in silence. The radio stayed off. I couldn't focus on the road. Every red light felt like a punishment for believing in something that had already ended. At the post office, I went through the motions, sorting mail, checking routes, but my hands shook. People noticed. My coworker Harold, a man who'd been through 2 divorces, watched me for a while before finally saying, "You got that look, Gaines," the one that says, "Your home ain't home no more." I tried to smile, but the truth was sitting heavy in my chest. "Something like that," I said. When I got home that evening, the house was quiet again. Her car was in the driveway, but the lights were dim. She was on the couch, scrolling on her phone, her face lit by that same cold glow. I stood in the doorway and asked, "Can we talk?" She sighed like it was a chore. "About what?" "About us," I said. Her eyes didn't leave the screen. "Elliot, I'm tired. Can we not do this right now?" I stepped closer. "I'm just trying to understand what's happening. I feel like I don't even know you anymore." She set the phone down, crossed her arms, and stared at me. "You want the truth? Fine. I'm bored, Elliot. You don't make me feel alive anymore. You do everything right, but there's no spark. And if you think checking my phone is going to fix that, you're wrong." The honesty hit harder than any lie could. I felt myself shrinking under the weight of her words. "So you are talking to him," I said quietly. She shook her head. "I'm talking to whoever I want, because I need to remember what it feels like to be wanted." I had no response. I just stood there, watching the woman I once knew confess to something worse than cheating. She had stopped caring. That was the real betrayal. That night, she went to bed without another word. I stayed in the kitchen, sitting at the table, listening to the refrigerator hum and the clock tick. I stared at the small pile of mail I'd brought home and realized how strange it felt to be surrounded by letters meant for everyone but me. People wrote to stay connected. I had a wife who was in the same house and already gone. Hours passed. I walked through the rooms quietly, looking at the framed photos of our wedding, the trips we took, the smiles that had once been real. I touched the glass, feeling the distance between the man I was then and the man standing there now. By the time I crawled into bed, Clara was turned away from me, her breathing slow and even. I wanted to reach out to hold her one last time, but I didn't. The moment I did, I knew it would feel empty. I lay awake until her phone buzzed again. This time I didn't check the name. I didn't need to. I already knew. The next morning, I went through the motions again. I made coffee, ironed my shirt, and watched her eat breakfast while typing on her phone. She looked up once and smiled like everything was fine. That smile felt like a stranger's. When she left for work, I stood at the window and watched her drive away. The car disappeared around the corner, and the silence that followed was so deep it felt like the house itself was holding its breath. I sat down and thought about what my father had said years ago. A man's peace is in his home. Protect it. I realized I had already lost mine. That was the moment I decided I wouldn't fight anymore. Not for her attention, not for her trust, not for a marriage that had become a performance. I didn't know what I would do yet, but I knew I couldn't stay another night living like a ghost in a house that used to be my life. The decision didn't feel like anger. It felt like clarity. And once that clarity settled in, I understood that the next move I made had to be final. When morning came, I sat on the edge of the bed and stared at the sunlight creeping across the floor. The world outside looked normal, calm, peaceful. Inside me, everything was shifting. I could not keep living in a house that felt like a stranger's home. Clara was still asleep, her hand resting on the phone that had become her closest companion. I watched her for a long moment and realized I no longer recognized the woman I had married. The person lying next to me was someone who laughed at my pain and treated my trust like a nuisance. That realization did not spark rage. It brought a strange calm, the kind that follows when a storm has already done its worst. I got up quietly, showered, dressed, and went to the closet. My side was still full of clothes I hadn't worn in months. As I packed, I noticed how little of me there really was in that house. Clara had filled every corner with her touch. The paintings, the candles, the framed quotes about love and adventure that no longer had meaning. I folded my shirts neatly, placed them in a duffel bag, and felt a steady rhythm of finality in every motion. In the dresser drawer, I found our wedding album. The edges were worn and the cover smelled faintly of cedar from the chest it had been stored in. I opened it and stared at our younger selves, smiling under the arch of white roses, her hands gripping mine like she would never let go. I took a breath and closed it gently. I packed it last. Downstairs, the house was silent except for the ticking clock. On the kitchen counter, I placed my wedding ring. It felt heavier than I remembered, as if it carried all the words we never said. I slid it next to a folded letter I had written earlier that morning. The letter was short. I didn't want to fill it with bitterness or blame. It said, "Clara, you were my home once. I loved you with everything I had. I don't know when we stopped being a team, but I know I can't stay where I'm no longer wanted. I hope you find what you're chasing. You won't have to explain anything to me again. Elliot." I stood there, reading it one last time, then placed it next to her coffee mug. Before I left, I opened the drawer where she kept her old phones and chargers. There was one she had replaced a few years back that still worked. I turned it on, switched it for her current one, and placed the new one on the counter. Inside that phone, I left something that had been sitting in my desk drawer for months, a printed photo from the town reunion last summer. In it, Clara stood beside Dean Russell, his hand around her waist, both of them smiling like no one else existed. She had told me that picture never existed, that someone was just spreading rumors. I found it tucked inside one of her old planners, hidden but not forgotten. On the back of the photo, I wrote in steady handwriting, "Don't worry. You'll never have to explain this to me again." I turned off the lights, took one last look around, and walked out the door. The air was cool, the sky pale with the first light of dawn. I loaded my bags into the truck and sat there for a long minute. My hands rested on the steering wheel, steady for the first time in months. When I finally started the engine, I didn't look back. I drove to my sister Margot's house across town. She lived in a small brick home with wind chimes on the porch and a faded welcome mat that had seen better days. When I knocked, she opened the door, wearing her robe and holding a cup of coffee. Her eyes widened when she saw the bags. "Elliot," she said softly, "you finally did it, didn't you?" I nodded. "I'm done, Margot. I can't live like that anymore." She stepped aside and let me in. The warmth of her kitchen hit me immediately, smelling like toast and cinnamon. She poured me a cup of coffee without asking any questions. After a few minutes of silence, she said, "Dad would be proud of you. He always said peace comes when you stop fighting battles you can't win." "I don't know if I feel peaceful," I said. "I just feel empty." "That's how peace starts," she replied. I stayed with her that morning, watching the sunlight spread across her kitchen table. It was strange how something so simple could feel like a new beginning. My phone buzzed once, but I didn't check it. I already knew who it was. Clara would wake up soon, find the empty bed, and realize she wasn't the one who walked away this time. By noon, I turned my phone off completely. Margot suggested we go see Dad. I hesitated at first, but then I agreed. He lived 20 minutes away in a small farmhouse he'd built with his own hands 40 years ago. When I walked through his door, he looked up from his recliner and gave me a long, knowing look. "She pushed you too far, didn't she?" he asked. I didn't need to answer. He stood slowly, walked over, and put his hand on my shoulder. "You did the right thing, son. Sometimes walking away isn't weakness, it's survival." I felt my throat tighten. For the first time in months, I allowed myself to breathe without the weight of pretending. We sat outside on the porch after that, two men who had both learned that love can't be forced to stay. As the day faded, I called my supervisor and took a week off work. I needed space to think, to decide where to go next. That night, I slept in the guest room at Margot's house. The sheets smelled like fresh laundry and quiet forgiveness. When I woke the next morning, the first thought that came to me wasn't about Clara or Dean or betrayal. It was about freedom. I realized that even though my heart was bruised, I was still standing. I had left without shouting, without revenge, without cruelty. I had chosen peace. In that decision, something in me changed. I was no longer the man who waited for her to come home. I was the man who finally chose to go. And as I sat by Margot's window watching the sunrise, I understood what my father meant all those years ago. A man's peace is in his home. I had lost mine, but now I was on my way to finding it again. When the morning sun crept through the blinds, Clara stirred in bed. The sheets beside her were cold. At first, she assumed I had gone for an early shift. She rolled over, yawning, and reached for her phone. It wasn't there. She frowned, sat up, and looked around. The closet door was open. My side was empty. The drawers were pulled out, and my things were gone. Her confusion sharpened into unease as she walked through the house. Every trace of me had vanished. My boots weren't by the door, my jacket wasn't on the hook, and the smell of my aftershave no longer lingered in the bathroom. She called my name once, then again, louder. The silence that answered her was the kind that hums in your ears. She walked into the kitchen, her bare feet cold on the tile. That was when she saw it. On the counter, beside her favorite coffee mug, sat my wedding ring, a folded letter, and a phone she didn't recognize. She stared at them for a long moment before reaching out. Her hand trembled slightly as she unfolded the letter and read it. Each line stripped away her composure. The words were simple but final. There were no accusations, no anger, only the kind of stillness that follows when someone has already said everything that needs to be said. When she turned the letter over, the photo slipped out. She froze. It was the picture from the reunion, the one she thought no one had ever found. There she was, leaning against Dean Russell, his arm around her waist, her face tilted toward him in a way that left no room for misunderstanding. On the back of the photo were 9 words written in my hand. "Don't worry, you'll never have to explain this to me again." Her breath caught in her throat. She looked around the room as if I might still be there, ready to yell or break something, but the house remained still. She picked up the phone, turned it on, and the screen lit up with notifications. Dozens of them, messages, calls, and alerts from people she knew. Her heart dropped as she opened the first one. Every message she had exchanged with Dean for the past 6 months had been forwarded to her contacts. The messages were blunt, personal, and impossible to misread. The phone was flooded with replies. Her mother had called 3 times. Her father had sent a message that said, "Clara, what have you done?" Her coworkers had texted questions she couldn't bear to read. Even mutual friends had written things like, "You need to fix this," and Elliot didn't deserve that. Her phone rang again, and this time she answered. It was Dean. His voice was sharp with panic. "Clara, what the hell is this? Everyone's texting me. My wife saw everything." She gripped the counter, her voice cracking. "He must have done something to the phones. I don't know how, Dean." "You told me he was harmless," Dean snapped. "Now my marriage is on the line because of you." "Don't you dare blame me," she said, her voice rising. "You're the one who kept texting me." The line went dead. She stood there in the kitchen, clutching the phone, her heart racing. The house around her felt wrong, stripped bare. Even the walls seemed emptier. The laughter that had once filled the rooms was gone. Her next call was to Margot. When my sister answered, her voice was calm. "He's here," she said before Clara could speak. Clara's words tumbled out in a rush. "Please, Margot, just tell him to come home. I didn't mean what I said. It got out of hand. I need to talk to him." "He doesn't want to talk, Clara," Margot replied. "You laughed at him when he was hurting. You don't get to ask for his voice now." Clara's tone softened to pleading. "Please, Margot, I made a mistake. He's my husband." "No," Margot said, firm and steady. "He was your husband. Now he's just a man who finally stopped begging to be seen." She hung up. Clara stared at the phone, shaking. Her chest tightened until she could barely breathe. She walked to the window and looked outside. The driveway was empty, the spot where my truck usually sat now a blank space. In that silence, the truth hit her. She hadn't just lost her husband. She had lost the one person who never gave up on her. The same man she mocked for being too predictable was the one who had built her safety. The man she called boring was the one who held her world together. As word spread through town, the story reached everyone. Her parents drove over that afternoon, but she didn't open the door. She sat on the floor of the living room holding the photo, trying to understand how everything had turned against her in a single morning. Meanwhile, I sat on my father's porch, drinking coffee with him and Margot. The sky was clear, and the fields beyond his house stretched in gold and green. My phone was on the table, face down. I hadn't turned it on since I left. Dad looked at me. "You think she gets it now?" "I think she finally understands what silence feels like," I said. He nodded. "Good. Some people don't listen until the noise stops." I leaned back in the chair, the tension in my shoulders easing for the first time in months. For so long, I had been the man who waited, who forgave, who believed that if I just held on, she would come back to me. Now, for the first time, I felt free. The next day, I heard from a friend in town that Clara had started calling people, trying to explain herself, trying to tell her version of the story. Most weren't interested. Her reputation was damaged, her confidence shaken, and the sympathy she expected never came. People saw the messages, they saw the photo, they knew what she had done. As I listened, I didn't feel joy or triumph. I felt relief. I hadn't destroyed her life. I had simply shown it for what it was. That night, as the sun went down, I walked to the edge of the property where the cornfields met the horizon. The air smelled like rain and soil. I stood there with my hands in my pockets, feeling the quiet hum of the earth around me. For months, I had tried to fix something that was already broken. That morning, when she found the letter and the photo, I hadn't just left her behind. I had left behind the version of myself that kept waiting for permission to be respected. The house in Maple Hollow was no longer mine. The life I built there was gone. But standing under that wide Indiana sky, I realized that losing Clara wasn't the end of my story. It was the beginning of my peace. A week after I left, the air felt different. It was lighter, quieter, cleaner somehow. The kind of quiet that doesn't echo with guilt or confusion. I woke up early every morning at my father's farmhouse, drank coffee on the porch, and watched the sun stretch over the fields. The simple sounds of roosters crowing, the wind in the trees, and the creak of the old wooden steps became my new rhythm. For the first time in years, I wasn't waiting for a text, an apology, or an argument. I wasn't waiting for anything at all. My father never asked for details. He didn't need to. His silence carried understanding. One morning, he handed me a toolbox and said, "The fence out back needs fixing. Might do you some good." We spent the day working side by side, not saying much, just listening to the sound of nails sinking into wood and the hum of summer insects. When we were done, he wiped his hands and said, "You did the right thing. A man's heart breaks quiet, but it heals that way too." At night, I sat on the porch and thought about everything that had happened. I didn't feel hate toward Clara. What I felt was distance, a deep kind of acceptance that some people stop choosing you long before they walk away. I had spent years trying to keep something alive that had been gone for a long time. It took losing her to understand that peace doesn't come from holding on. It comes from letting go without bitterness. Clara tried to reach me several times. She called Margot, she called my father, and eventually she called my work. I never answered. Margot told me her voice sounded desperate, cracked with guilt and fear. She said Clara had moved out of the house 2 weeks after I left and was staying with her parents. The people she once surrounded herself with had stopped calling. Some pitied her, others judged her, but no one defended her. I didn't want revenge. I wanted distance. So I sold my share of the house through my lawyer, left the furniture to her, and took what little I needed. I moved into a small apartment above the hardware store in town. The place was old and smelled like pine and dust, but it was mine. I put my mother's locket on the nightstand, the wedding album in a drawer, and started building a life that was quiet but honest. It wasn't easy. There were nights when I caught myself reaching for the phone, thinking about the good years, the laughter we shared, the way she used to curl up next to me on the couch during thunderstorms. Then I'd remember how it felt to ask her a simple question and be met with ridicule. That memory was sharp enough to keep me grounded in reality. My coworkers started noticing the change. Harold, the same man who had warned me before, slapped me on the back one morning and said, "You look 10 years younger, Gaines. Guess peace looks good on you." I smiled and realized he was right. One Sunday, I took Margot and Dad out for breakfast at May's Corner, the same diner where I had met Clara years ago. The waitress, a woman named Denise with kind eyes and a laugh that sounded like home, recognized me. "You used to come in here with your wife," she said gently. I nodded. "I did, a long time ago." She poured me coffee and smiled. "Well, you look like you're finally breathing again." Her words stayed with me. Breathing again. That was exactly what it felt like. Over the next few months, I focused on rebuilding. I picked up carpentry projects around town, helped Margot fix up her porch, and spent more time with my father than I had in years. Slowly, the ache of betrayal faded into something quieter. It became a scar, a reminder of what I survived, not what I lost. I began therapy after Margot gently insisted. It helped me untangle the guilt I carried, the questions that lingered in the back of my mind. My therapist asked me one question that changed everything. "Elliot, if you had stayed, what would have been left of you?" That question became the line that divided my old life from my new one. Staying would have meant shrinking, apologizing for my own pain, and pretending not to see what was right in front of me. Leaving meant reclaiming the man I used to be before love turned into survival. 6 months later, I heard through a mutual friend that Clara had sold the house and moved to a nearby city. She was struggling to rebuild her reputation and had left real estate altogether. I didn't feel pity or satisfaction. I simply wished her peace, the same way I wished it for myself. One evening, I drove out to the lake where we used to fish together. The water was calm, reflecting the orange sky. I stood there for a long time, letting the quiet sink in. I thought about how easily love can turn into routine, how trust can fade in silence, and how sometimes the bravest thing a person can do is walk away with dignity. As the wind rippled across the lake, I spoke softly to no one in particular. "I forgive you, Clara. Not for you, but for me." The words came out steady and clear. In that moment, I felt the last of the weight lift from my chest. Forgiveness didn't mean I wanted her back. It meant I no longer carried her mistakes as my own burden. When I drove home that night, I didn't feel alone. The small apartment lights glowed warmly against the dark, and for the first time in a long time, the space felt like home. I brewed a cup of coffee, sat by the window, and looked out at the street below. Life hadn't turned out the way I imagined, but it had given me something better than what I asked for. It had given me peace, clarity, and a sense of self I hadn't known I'd lost. Before bed, I opened the drawer where the wedding album rested. I looked at the first photo of us smiling under that arch of white roses. I closed the cover gently, put it back, and turned off the light. As I lay down, a quiet thought crossed my mind. Sometimes walking away isn't about giving up. It's about finally choosing yourself after years of being forgotten. I fell asleep without dreams, knowing that my story didn't end in heartbreak. It ended in freedom. That was the story of how I lost everything I thought I wanted, only to find the peace I truly needed. Sometimes, life teaches its hardest lessons in silence. When trust is broken, it doesn't always end with shouting or revenge. Sometimes it ends quietly, with a man packing his things, walking away, and finally learning how to live again. If this story made you think about your own relationships or reminded you of a time when you had to choose yourself, remember this: peace is not weakness, it's strength in its calmest form. Thank you for watching this story all the way through. I hope it moved you the same way it moved me to tell it. Every story here is about resilience, heartbreak, and the choices that define who we become. If you connected with Elliot's story, make sure to give this video a like. It helps more people find these powerful stories. Share it with someone who might need a reminder that walking away can be the beginning of healing. And don't forget to comment below. I read every message, and I'd love to hear what you think. Have you ever had to start over after betrayal? How did it change you? Lastly, subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications so you never miss another story like this one. Each week, I'll share more real, emotionally gripping stories that speak to the heart. Stories about strength, loss, forgiveness, and finding your way home. Thank you again for watching. Until next time, take care of yourself, trust your instincts, and remember, sometimes leaving is the most loving thing you can do for your own soul.